Good afternoon. I'm Khaleh Esfandiari. I run the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. We are very happy to have with us Hassan, the author of, co-author of ISIS Inside the Army of Terror. He's based in Abu Dhabi, and I think he's here for a couple of days only, and we are very fortunate to host him as the first institution in Washington. And his book appeared on the New York Times bestseller list. Yesterday it was number 9. I didn't check it this morning. And we decided, and Hassan is going to speak for 20 minutes, and then we will open the floor to your questions. And we are very happy to have with us Jane Harman, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, who is very much interested in ISIS, has talked many times on ISIS, but today we will get first-hand reports on what is going on the ground and the history of the movement. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'd like to start with the talk would be sort of 3 historical snapshots that help understand ISIS and where it comes from. The first one is the 1990s, the second one is the Iraq War, and then the Arab Spring. In the 1990s, 2 very interesting trends happened in Iraq after the first Gulf War and the sanctions against the Saddam Hussein regime. The first one is that Saddam Hussein inaugurated this campaign called Al-Hamla al-Imaniya in Arabic, which is the Islamic faith campaign. What he did was to basically Islamize Baathism. He introduced a variety of measures to encourage people to go to Hajj at the expense of the state. He allowed Baathists to study religion, to go to mosques and so on. The mix that happened, the mix between Baathism and Salafism was very relevant to what ISIS represents today in terms of ideology. Baathism, as you all know, is a fascist movement. It's a movement that relies on it has a lot to do actually with ISIS ideology. It's a pan-Arabist instead of compared to pan-Islamist as ISIS is. It relies on this kind of nationalism, militant nationalism that subjects everything and anyone to the overarching principle, which is to achieve the unity of all Arabs. And it's a very violent group. Essentially, it's like by definition, it's a violent group. Or ideology. If you look at the history of Baathism in Iraq and Syria, Saddam Hussein did horrible things to Shiites and to Kurds. He used chemical weapons against them. Bashar al-Assad did chemical weapons also on his people. Basically attacked civilians. You know quite well what the Assad regime is doing today. But also his father, Hafez al-Assad, did the same thing. So the track record of Baathism is all violent from day one until today. Now, when Saddam Hussein Islamized this ideology, we get a very dangerous mix. Basically, you got maybe unintentionally, because he, after the first Gulf War or around during the war, there was a Shia revolt in the south against his rule. So he started to feel a lot of pressure from within. So he used that campaign to kind of encourage, kind of legitimize his regime. What happened usually is that a lot of Baathists abandon Baathism and take on Salafism, because Salafism is more invigorating, more it's more pure, let's say, than Baathism, although they have a lot of similarities. So Saddam Hussein, towards the end of his regime, he started to have a problem with Islamists, and a lot of them went to Afghanistan or elsewhere, and he had a lot of problems with kind of like the rise in Salafist trend. Now, that's the first thing that happened in the 1990s. The second thing that happened was, because of the sanctions, Saddam Hussein started this underground financial network to kind of circumvent the sanctions. So he started to rely on this kind of underground smuggling, different ways of making money, and working with other countries, beyond the Iraqi borders. And that campaign, or that kind of network that was created by Saddam Hussein, is exactly the kind of network that ISIS uses today to circumvent the airstrikes, to make sure that it can survive in the black market, and in Syria and Iraq, and beyond Syria and Iraq. So these are two important things that originate in the 1990s, and they're relevant to the period today. After the Iraq War, that's a second snapshot, historical snapshot. After the Iraq War, the Iraq War caused Sunnis to feel that they have lost power. So they are minority. Arab Sunnis are minority in Iraq, and they suddenly felt that they no longer in control. They felt that the Americans were conspiring with the Shiites and with the Kurds, and even with Iran, to take over politics. And now there are indications that there are bases basically for this kind of conspiratorial thinking, because the first elections that happened after the Americans started to hand over power to the Iraqis was dominated by Shia and Kurds, and Sunnis boycotted the elections and lost control. So there was a restoration, like a kind of sense that they're losing power, and you start to have a movement dedicated to the restoration of Sunni domination in Iraq. Now, that meant you have a strange alliance between Salafists and Ba'athists, not very strange, but it looks strange, between Ba'athists and between local forces who might not be either that or the other. So you have a lot of people. We speak in research for the book, we spoke with a lot of people who interviewed these people in the beginning, and a lot of them would say, we're not fighting because of Saddam Hussein. We don't it's not about Saddam Hussein. It's about us. It's about Sunni and so on. So it was Sunni in the sense of local communities, not in a sectarian sense. Still not very sectarian in the strict sense of the word. Now, come to the stage, Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, he's a Jordanian jihadist. He had a long history of fighting or jihadi kind of activities in Jordan and beyond Jordan. In the 1980s, he went to Afghanistan to fight jihad, to join the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And what happened was, immediately there was a strange encounter between Osama bin Laden and Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. There was clearly differences between them in terms of what jihad means and why we wage jihad. Osama bin Laden and Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi's differences since then kind of shape and define the differences between Al-Qaeda and ISIS today. At the time, Osama bin Laden, or Al-Qaeda generally, sees its mission, the name indicates, the name Al-Qaeda means a vanguard. So they think that their mission is to set an example for all Muslims to join this jihadi movement. So they want to trigger, they always repeat the word that we are a trigger, that we want to popularize jihad. We want to encourage all Muslims to join in jihad. Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, on the other hand, he was more focused on Shia. He thinks that the arch enemies of Islam are Shia, the enemy within. This is what we have. This is why the Ottoman Empire fell, because of the Safavids, and before that all the movements in Islamic history, the Umayyads and so on, were always challenged by the Shia. So he sees Shia as the existential threat that has always existed and that has to be dealt with. Osama bin Laden thinks that the enemy is the West, and Al-Qaeda focuses on the West, focuses on the Muslim world only to kind of encourage people. So it's more based on consent and more, for example, in Syria, you find Jabhat al-Nusra, which is affiliated to Al-Qaeda, focusing on winning hearts and mind. It has never, until recently, tried to impose itself on or its ideology on the people. So they provide services, they do all this kind of stuff because they want to encourage people to like them. And even in the beginning, they didn't want to announce that they're part of the Qaeda because they didn't want to. They were doing the name to shape people's attitudes towards them. So in the beginning, they wanted to say that we are Syrian group. So Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi went to Iraq after the Iraq War, and his debate and his vision about Shia started to slowly shape the discourse in Iraqi. Iraqi Sunnis and Shia have always lived together. They intermarried, like they had the same family, Shia and Sunni. After the Iraq War, things started to change, and Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi found a huge opportunity in that. And then there was a lot of differences between Al-Qaeda and Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi at the time. And although he pledged allegiance to Osama bin Laden, there was still tension between the two until Al-Qaeda kind of started to publicly admonish Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi to stop attacking Shia civilians and focus on the government and on the Americans. But then Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi had his way later on slowly. He destroyed or he helped bomb the Askari mosque, which kind of triggered the Iraqi civil war. And things started to become more sectarian. And now his vision, combined with already you have a very dangerous mix between Ba'athism and Salafism, and here comes sectarianism of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. You have the triangle of basically terror, and the triangle of like a very dangerous ingredients coming together, merging together to form this group that we have today, ISIS. That's why you have ISIS. It's very violent. It's very fascist. It's very sectarian. And it's very, rigid and everything, because that's the kind of that's the background. Now, after the Arab Spring, ISIS, benefited from a lot of factors to kind of grow into this state. It was already a state, but after the Arab Spring, it found itself with a lot of opportunities, power vacuum, collapsing states, weak states, and ISIS, applied all its skills and all its kind of intelligence and security skills to kind of present itself and pose itself and become a reality, in fact, on the ground in both countries. Now, it benefits, for example, if benefit from a trend that. ISIS, a lot of people think they try to portray it as just a violent group, but it has a lot to do with trends in the region. So one the trends I talked about, but another trend is, Arab young people, when they revolted against their governments, they revolted against two elites, the political elite and the religious elite. And ISIS is actually about rebellion against the political elite and the religious elite. So it's very anti-clerical in that sense. It's against authority. There is an Arabic word that usually people use to describe the attitudes of young people, which is rafd al-wasaya al-fikriya, which is a rejection of intellectual monopoly or intellectual mandate or intellectual control. So when anyone tries to message against ISIS, the kind of messaging that you talk about all the time, political messaging and religious messaging, ISIS is immune to these things. So when people talk about moderate discourse, encourage moderate discourse, ISIS is immune to that by nature. So you might prevent people from going to ISIS before that, but I always say once someone starts to buy into ISIS ideology, that's almost too late to reverse it. I spoke to someone in Turkey who, a journalist would call him a defector. So he was leaving ISIS. He got a work permit to study, not to study, to work in Saudi Arabia. He got not a job offer, but like a work permit. And he was in Turkey trying to kind of fix his passport before he goes to Saudi Arabia. There I met him, and I was expecting him to be critical of ISIS, right? But he was sitting there defending ISIS. He said, "I'm tired. This is not for me. I can't take it. It's too violent and all this kind of stuff," right? But he never said anything bad about ISIS. So I'm convinced that when people join ISIS and leave and say they have abandoned the group, they're most likely either lying or they've never been with ISIS. So that's mostly like, generally speaking or broadly speaking. So yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that ISIS shares with the Arab Spring kind of, not values, but like, trends. ISIS has benefited from a variety of things. I can talk about for days, but, I'd prefer to hear more questions and then, from you, and then I can answer them. That's okay.
Thank you very much. Let me ask you the first question, which is on everybody's mind. Can ISIS be defeated?
It's possible to defeat ISIS, but I see it, in the region for at least another 15 years. ISIS might. Okay, I think you can look at ISIS in two ways. ISIS, as we know, as we see it today, as a group that operates as an army, as an insurgency, and as a terror group, will exist for, say, around a decade from now. It will be probably 5 years to a decade. But as a group that exists and has some kind of one way of another exists in Iraq and Syria and beyond, I think it will continue to operate. I think it will override Al-Qaeda. It will become a global kind of inspiration for jihadis, and it's like one of the fascinating things about ISIS project today is that people don't see that there's an emerging, a new jihadi school that's been established. It hasn't been established yet, so ISIS is not like Al-Qaeda. It doesn't have ideologues who are very well established. They have a legacy of jihad since Afghanistan, Egypt, Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq until today. They don't have that kind of legacy as Al-Qaeda does. But they are establishing that kind of ideology that has ideologues, that have ideas, it has books, and has theories, and so on. But it is emerging as that. So because of that, I don't see ISIS disappearing anytime soon, at least in that sense. As an army, as an insurgency, I think, if I am optimistic, probably 5 years.
Jay?
Thank you for that very interesting presentation. Yesterday, I had lunch with the Indonesian ambassador to the U.S., who reminded me, I guess I needed reminding, that Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. It has 250 million people, more or less, 87% of whom are Muslim. Many of the senior members of the government, including this ambassador, are Muslim, and it is a peaceful democracy. My question is this the only example, or is this an important example of an alternative Muslim idea? And could it somehow be considered and used in a more effective way as a counter to ISIS?
ISIS thrives on weak states. Indonesia, Malaysia, and countries in the South, Southeast Asia. They have a legacy of good governance, and whenever you find good governance, ISIS cannot gain ground, because ISIS is about it's a political project, and that's essential as much as it's a religious project. But the two come together. So you have a political background, which is basically you're alienated, you're estranged by local politics and by your government politics. But also you have to have a religious background that believes in a very narrow worldview about who is a Muslim, or what a Muslim should be, or how a Muslim should be. Now, unless you have these two backgrounds, and that's why people confuse it. Sometimes they argue ISIS is political, and some people say no, ISIS is Islamic. The fact of the matter, it's more nuanced than that. It's both, and unless you have these two backgrounds together merging, that's when you mix the two and you produce an ISIS member. So you might have people sympathizing with ISIS in Indonesia, but they never join ISIS. I think, for example, I think Tunisia is a good example. Tunisia has, there are around 4,000 Tunisian jihadists fighting in Iraq and Syria, but they haven't announced a province, a wilaya for them in Tunisia. Why? When they did the same thing in Libya, although they don't have that many jihadists in Libya. The reason is because Libya is, there's no state there, it's collapsed. In Tunisia, the population is more condensed, but also the state is still present, is still visible, and it still offers hope for people. So, the Gulf states, for example, they don't have a threat with ISIS. They are not in Indonesia, like Saudi Arabia is not in Tunisia in terms of the tolerance and so on. But ISIS does not present a threat there. So it's about a state being present, but also good governance and so on. So there are,
Yeah, so just to make the point, part of the answer to Hala is a way to defeat ISIL is to have a strong government, even with a majority Muslim population. And places like Indonesia, Tunisia, and others are much less susceptible to their messages because of that.
They are susceptible to message. I mean, ISIS might have sympathy in Damascus, for example, but Damascus has is well held by the government in Damascus. ISIS operates in a different way. Sometimes an ISIS member, and I found this, personally, a lot of ISIS members don't say they are ISIS members. So don't be, if you don't have a lot of jihadis in Indonesia, that does not mean they don't have a problem. Right. They might have a problem. It depends on how, how ISIS, fares in the future. I think if ISIS continues to exist and kind of prove to be resilient, I think it will continue to grow. First, I think the first target for it is jihadi sympathizers, let's say in North Africa and in West Africa and the Horn of Africa, for example. There are a lot of jihadists who sympathize with Al-Qaeda. They still have bay'ah to Al-Qaeda. They have allegiance to Al-Qaeda, but they don't have, they think their interest is still with Al-Qaeda. And I think once ISIS established itself not only as a resilient group, but as an ideology, established ideology with ideologues and everything, and also as a financial model, I think it might gain a lot of ground in the future in North Africa, in Africa in general, but also in different parts of the world. So I think the process of ISIS growth is still on. It's still growing. I don't think ISIS is being defeated as you hear in the headlines. ISIS has been contained in some parts of Iraq and Syria. They have been rolled back in areas where ISIS was on or had been on the offensive. So they were targeting Kurds inside Kurdish territory, and they were targeting Shia inside Shia territories. Now they were rolled back to all Sunni areas. But its heartlands until Tikrit have not been threatened by any kind of internal or external challenges. And that won't happen. I don't think, if you look at Raqqa or Manbij and Al-Bab in eastern Aleppo, or even Deir ez-Zor and Mosul, you don't really know what's going on there, and that's usually an indication when you have a blackout in an area. That is an indication that ISIS is so entrenched in the area. It has eliminated any kind of rivalry and potential rivalry. Any activist operating in these areas is marked for death. Any tribal sheikh who might potentially be a threat to ISIS, they eliminate him. If there's an intellectual or a doctor or like technocrat living in ISIS areas and has not pledged allegiance to ISIS, they marked him as a threat and they watched him very closely. And they're slowly, and surely they are making good use of their time in ISIS, in their heartlands to build that project and make sure it's sustainable, to make sure ISIS is immune from like bottom up, rebellions in these areas. So, I think I see the situation as favoring ISIS so far. For the time being.
Let me ask you one more question, and then we'll open the floor. And we have a lot of questions from the overflow too. In your book, you write that ISIS is not only a terrorist organization, but a mafia, and it deals in oil and armed trafficking. How do they do that?
Yeah.
I mean, the armed trafficking is that because they take over, the armed depots that are in Iraq or so on, or do they sell them, or I mean,
Yeah, it goes back
a
to
bit about their financing in context of this.
Yeah, it goes back to the question of like the underground network that ISIS, the Saddam Hussein regime established back in the 1990s. ISIS, gets its money through a variety of reasons. Again, a variety of ways. The two most important sources of its income were oil and weapon stockpiles. So when they conquer a new facility and seize it, they take a lot of weapons. I mean, you remember in June last year when they forced 3 American-trained, American-equipped Iraqi security forces to drop their arms and just run away in Mosul and in surrounding areas. They got billions worth of weapons, very advanced weapons, and that kind of one operation helped them to go back to Syria and conquer new areas like Deir ez-Zor. Deir ez-Zor, for example, it's a good example because Deir ez-Zor had been resistant to ISIS presence since the beginning. ISIS tried very hard to establish a base for it, like a social base in ISIS, in Deir ez-Zor, but it was never successful. It actually it's interesting because Deir ez-Zor, the province, was one of the rare ones that ISIS did not actually have a social base. I'm talking about eastern Syria and the north. So you don't have like locals pledging allegiance to ISIS. It was mostly individuals here and there and foreigners trying to kind of make a base for themselves in Deir ez-Zor. Now, ISIS struggled to gain ground there. It was defeated several times in Deir ez-Zor. Jabhat al-Nusra was the only one that could actually entrench itself in Deir ez-Zor. It was the most powerful, and its branch in Deir ez-Zor was the most powerful across Syria. And but after the takeover of Mosul, ISIS basically went back and swept the area, and like within weeks, it took over Deir ez-Zor and it kind of dismantled Jabhat al-Nusra from the eastern Syria. Jabhat al-Nusra no longer exists in Syria because of the American weapons ISIS got from Mosul. So that source of income has been cut since the airstrikes. They no longer can expand in other areas and get the money. The oil also, because I think 80% at least of the oil resources have been disrupted in ISIS areas. But ISIS still has, in the book we have a chapter about like finances, and ISIS has a very interesting system that is different from Al Qaeda, that can sustain itself without foreign donations and without help from outsiders. They can survive on local money. So they have, they provide services. But unlike Islamists who provide services as a way of social bribe, they run the services and they charge people for it. They act as a state. So, for example, when Syria, or much of Syria, was controlled by the Free Syrian Army for months, what the Free Syrian Army used to do is, if it was like really good, they would try to convince the population to either go to, like individuals to go to work, or to share oil if they are a powerful family and they control oil well. They, Free Syrian Army, or even Jabhat al-Nusra, or Ahrar al-Sham, and like Islamists in general, they wouldn't try to impose themselves in the communities, local communities. They will try to, it's based on consent. Now, when ISIS came, it was a completely different story. ISIS imposed its own, rules. It acted as a state. So, for example, if someone gets money from the Syrian government because he used to work as a municipality staff, like a municipality worker, ISIS forced that person to go to work, to show up to work like 8 hours a day for 5 days a week. If you want your salary, you have to work. If someone owns a bakery, for example, and ISIS comes and asks the person, why you closed your bakery? You say, I don't have money. They say, okay, we'll provide you with the flour, any materials you need, but you operate the bakery. And if you don't operate the bakery, we take it. We confiscate it from you. And what happens usually is the person says, okay, give me the flour, give you share from the revenue, and we operate the bakery. They would have an ISIS member outside the bakery, making sure the line is straight, like there's no one jumping the line, and so on. So they kind of, it's a part of their propaganda to act as a state. They want to regulate it. The police, traffic police, for example, in the past, the Syrian traffic police would receive a bribe from any driver, and there's always chaos. There's no actually traffic rules. With ISIS, everyone has to respect the road and the road rules. If someone works in transportation, when the Free Syrian Army used to control, the areas. So if someone is traveling from Aleppo to eastern Syria, or maybe to the borders of Iraq, they would be stopped several times by the Free Syrian Army or any like gangs on the way, and they would ask them for a bribe. When ISIS came, it would act again as a state. So they would stop. There's a checkpoint in Aleppo, in eastern Aleppo, and they would document basically what the person is carrying. So like stationery, whatever. They write it down and they they stamp it, and then the driver can drive from Aleppo to Mosul, right? And no one would stop him. And if they stop him, you can just give the document, and that's it. So a lot of people start to like this, this kind of a new governing body in their areas. At least they have rules and regulations. They have like law and order. And another important thing is that people can live with brutality. If you don't mess up with ISIS wouldn't mess up with you. That's how people see it in these areas. But if you mess with ISIS, you're gonna like pay dearly with it. So people say, you know what, I don't want to mess up with ISIS, and they compare that situation with the situation inside the regime's area. Inside the regime's area, even if you support the regime, you can be a target by like random shelling or random bombing. The Assad regime targets whole neighborhoods. ISIS has never done that. So people see it. I mean, I'm talking about the perception on the ground. People see that, as a, let's say Tikrit, when ISIS entered Tikrit, it entered it without shooting a bullet on the civilians, because everyone just accepted ISIS. Now, when the government forces want to enter Tikrit, they will destroy the whole village in order to expel ISIS. So you can see the equation, see how people think about ISIS.
Aaron David Miller in the back had a question.
Thanks, Alwet. Fascinating presentation. Graham Wood argued in his Atlantic piece, I think, that defeating ISIS requires defeating the idea of the caliphate. That is to say, you demonstrate that there are natural limits to ISIS's expansion, and you try to accentuate the contradictions of governance, failure to provide services, accentuate conflicts between foreign fighters and locals. There's been a lot of media reporting that ISIS is weakening. Do you have any way to evaluate and assess whether Wood is right in his initial analysis? And second, whether or not these internal contradictions are actually appearing, and are they significant? Thanks.
Thank you. Ideology is very important to ISIS, and we have to also always understand that every member of ISIS has to comply with the sort of ideology that ISIS endorses. It's an ideology that the top leaders believe in. It's that kind of takfiri, radicalism, where like members believe in the excommunication of Muslims and the very narrow definition of who a Muslim is. So you can't say, as you would to other Islamists, that you pray 5 times a day, or you fast in Ramadan and so on, right? ISIS wouldn't accept that as evidence. They need to have evidence that you're not a disbeliever, somehow. Like they have very different standards of labeling Muslims as infidels. So the ideology is very important. Every member has to comply with it. No member kills without a fatwa from the clerics, unless, of course, in the battlefield or they declare war against people. They have to comply with fatwas, and these fatwas they're not random. They would be based on Islamic references. So I think the idea, this debate that we're hearing today, or like we're hearing about today, that ISIS has nothing to do with Islam. I think it's a Western debate, not a Middle Eastern debate. I think in the Middle East there is a recognition that we have a problem as Muslims. And if you follow Arabic newspapers like Al Hayat or Al Arabiya website and so on, there's it's flooded. These websites are flooded with articles written by Islamic scholars who studied religion and preached religion all the time. They talk about the problem that we're facing. When ISIS burns someone alive, they do it because someone in the history of Islam did it, right? ISIS is a Salafist movement, essentially, right? And Salafism means going back to the early figures in Islamic history and emulate them, because they were closer to the revelation, and therefore they have better understanding of what Islam is, right? So they don't always rely on the Quran, although they do, or the Hadith. They also rely on events and stories in Islamic history, and that's why I call kinetic Sharia. They don't always rely on theories. So when you want to address the ideas of ISIS, ISIS again is immune to the messages, because it considers all clerical establishment as illegitimate, and also because they can cite examples. I'll give you an example to clarify this better. Khalid bin Walid was an early figure, is very respected, at least within Sunnis, or by Sunnis. He was the first caliph's commander-in-chief. There was a battle in Iraq, in what's today Iraq, between the Muslim army and the Persian army at the time. And during the battle, the Muslim army was kind of being defeated. The Persian army was strong and powerful. So at some point, the Muslim army, the commander promised God, there's a word for it, which is nether, make a pledge to God, that if he defeats the Persian army, he would create or a river out of their blood, right? Eventually, he a very savvy commander, so he defeated the Persian army a day later, and he started slaughtering, the people who tried to flee. Now the tricky thing for him was he couldn't make a river out of their blood. So he started to think, he found himself, basically, he was put in a pickle, basically, that he needed to find a solution for this. So what he did is basically, go to the captives. So there were thousands of prisoners, caught by the Muslim army. And he wanted to kill the captives. Now, according to Islamic teachings, you cannot kill captives. You cannot kill prisoners of war. But he made a pledge to God, and he's like a companion of the Prophet. So he made a fatwa for himself that he could kill the captives. And so he started killing them. But also there was a problem of, it's not a river. You can't make a river from blood. Probably he didn't think it through. So at some point he kind of, released like a dam nearby, and he created a river. Eventually he got what he wanted. Now, you can, as a Muslim cleric, if you want to address the ideas of ISIS and say, why you're killing captives, this is haram, this is not acceptable by Islam, ISIS can just cite that example. So you can debate, all day long with ISIS, but it happened in Islamic history. So what they do is basically defer or refer anyone who argues with them to Khalid bin Walid, who's very respected in Islam by Muslims or by Sunnis, especially. By Sunnis, exactly. He's respected by Sunnis, so a Sunni cleric would not dare to basically argue against Khalid bin Walid. So what they end up doing is I'm not going to talk about it. So that's the problem we have. Nobody is talking about these things. Sometimes for sectarian reasons, because Khalid bin Walid is criticized by the Shia and respected by the Sunnis. So when you criticize Khalid bin Walid as a Sunni, you find yourself in a very awkward situation.
Max, just wait for the mic, please. Oh, sure. It's coming. Thank you.
Hello, Mike. Yeah. I was interested in hearing more about the actual leadership, and particularly the caliph himself, Baghdadi. I mean, we know very little about him, actually, and but it's striking that you've had organizations. The latest one is Boko Haram in Nigeria, declaring allegiance to a supreme leader that we know so little about, and they don't know much more than we do. I just wonder, how do you assess his importance within the organization? What happens to ISIS if he's killed, if he disappears? Is he replaceable? I'm just curious to know what your train of thought is about the leadership and his significance.
Okay. Shorter answers. Okay.
Shorter answers.
All right. I think everybody within ISIS is dispensable. ISIS has established its organization as a group that can get rid of anyone and everyone, and it kind of keeps that core that can, grow over time. They have learned from the lessons of the Sahwa, the awakening councils, and so on. So they can disappear. They can be eliminated almost entirely. They can, resurrect again because they have that kind of seed. Al-Baghdadi is dispensable because he has like a Shura council. He can be replaced if he is killed, or even if the whole Shura council is killed, they can, they can replace them. ISIS operates as a very profoundly autonomous group. So the top leaders are very loyal, long-standing loyalists to ISIS. They're firm believers in the group. But the lower ranks, there is kind of it's insulated from the top leadership, but there's always a link between the top leaders and the lower commands. But that's to ensure there's no infiltration. And even if there's infiltration within the lower ranks, they never have access to the higher middle level or even higher ranks. So organizationally, everyone is dispensable. And ISIS can survive. If you demolish ISIS in Mosul, it doesn't affect ISIS in Fallujah or in the whole of Anbar. So yeah.
Okay. 2 questions from the overflow. If you could briefly comment on financing that comes from the Gulf states to ISIS and private funding, but that. And also, whether you see a different theological reading that would be able to counter ISIS's core ideology. Is there such a thing?
About funding from the Gulf states, I think ISIS benefited from a period of chaos in terms of financing, financial flows, or like finances going to Syrians inside Syria up until the late 2012. Now ISIS was still not existent, wasn't in existence at the time. There were still ISI and there was still Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. But a lot of money was going through Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and Bahrain. They were not from the government, and they were not meant to go to jihadis. They were meant to go to moderate groups. Now, because of the lack of knowledge of who is who, sometimes the money goes to someone you trust, and that person gives it to someone he trusts, and then goes to groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and so on. So there's that loose network that exists, in these parts of the world. But on a governmental level, I think it's a myth that the Gulf states support ISIS. They see it as a threat. They see it more of a threat than the Americans do, or even Iran does. They see it as a threat because there are at least two sections within Gulf society that's vulnerable to ISIS. The Salafists, like the ones who believe in the idea of the caliphate and the invigorating kind of ideology of ISIS, but also Islamists who don't like ISIS, like say Muslim Brotherhood sympathizers. They don't like ISIS, but they see it as a desperate way to kind of break the status quo in the region. I spoke to a lot of people who oppose ISIS, don't like its violence, but they would say, you know what, just let this group roam around, just exist for a while. At least we will break this political stagnation that exists in the region. So there's, ISIS thrives in this climate. The theology, I think the problem is really not theology, it's about credibility usually, and about legitimacy. The problem with most of the clerical establishment in the Arab world and Muslim world is that they either aligned to the authoritarian regimes, they can't escape it, or because they've lost credibility because they for a variety of other reasons. To go back to the Arab Spring thing, I think the trend that we saw was the collapse of the religious elite at the time. A lot of young people didn't like the fact that there are religious clerics legitimizing the authoritarian governments. And the collapse of the clerical establishment, was a chance for everyone to kind of look for a more reformed Islam, Islam that is more tolerant, more progressive, and so on, right? But the group that sees this is ISIS. No one, enlightened Muslims, did not seize the opportunity. There was a collapse and weakening authority of clerics. There was more privatization of religious discourse. But ISIS took over, and they basically capitalized or tapped into this thing.
Yes, please. Just wait for the mic. It's coming. Here.
Mohammed Shina, Voice of America. Can you explain what exactly attracts young Muslims, even from Western communities, to join ISIS?
Sure. In the book, again, we found 6 different categories or factors why people join ISIS. These factors range from pragmatism, because they like governance, and could be because of social rivalry. In Syria, for example, when this revolution started, there were certain families in eastern Syria, let's say, who joined the uprising from the beginning. They kind of owned this kind of value or ideal that they are pro-revolution. So they start to build this status, social status. Rival families found ISIS very convenient to kind of reverse that situation. But I think 3 other factors. One is a political project. A lot of people don't agree with ISIS, a religious discourse, but they agree with its political project, and they drift towards ISIS because they find it a very viable political force that can change the situation, restore Sunni domination in this part of the world. And the other ones, like I told you, the long-standing radicals, that they drift towards this group because they believe in the ideology. They believe in the exact, the ideology of ISIS in all its details. And the other one is young zealots, and I think this is the most dangerous and most important category. Young people as young as 13 and even younger drift towards ISIS because they find the ideology very invigorating, again, very electrifying. They listen to these clerics on the ground telling them about what ISIS is and how you can be part of this kind of project that will restore the glory of Islam. And people who don't have Islamic training, they drift towards ISIS through these this kind of rhetoric. So they join ISIS because they want to be suddenly adults. They want to rebel against their parents. They want to, but they believe in the ideology. So once they join it, I spoke to a lot of parents who have, their children just disappeared from homes and joined ISIS later. They say when they start to argue with their children as young as 13, these children all of a sudden they sound like adults. They're very educated. They cite educated in like religiously. They cite all these hadiths and these sayings and these events. All of a sudden they know how to argue back against their parents. And a lot of people, at least half jokingly, they would say, I was almost convinced by my son, right? So, there are different ways. For Westerners, I think the appeal is different. Westerners who go to ISIS areas are usually detached from reality. They don't know what's happening there. And they go there because they become like susceptible to ISIS's propaganda, which is about Islamic State, it's about the end of time, it's about pure Islam, and so on. I think that's where social media comes into handy for ISIS, because it can communicate its messaging without people being distracted by the facts on the ground. It can just tell you what ISIS stands. And a lot of people buy into this.
Just wait for the mic, please.
So thank you very much for your insight. My question is regarding, it sounds as though a lot of this is a desire to restore to an era of glory. So how much is it then a historical argument, do you believe? And is religion more a means to an end in that aspect in order to return to this glorious age? And if you find that it is still more a religious argument, my next question would be, why Islam then? There are many religious texts that advocate fighting in the name of faith. So why is it this religion that has been interpreted in this way?
Let me add also something to her question. Sure. The way ISIS has been treating women across the board, whether it's Yazidis and other, has been barbaric, despicable. And how do they justify it, no matter how narrow their interpretation of Islam is?
It's a complicated question. I think ISIS, like I told you, ISIS argues through religious references. It uses religious references to justify anything it does, and it has like a rich source of literature it can derive its acts from, or it can legitimize its acts. Now, the interesting thing usually that ISIS deliberately, even if it finds legitimation of its acts in clear Islamic text, they can easily refer to Saudi or a Saudi penal code, and they can justify a lot of things. But they don't do that. What they do usually is they dig deeper, and they found very obscure teachings in Islamic history, events in history, people who did things, historical event. It's precedent. It's like I told you, because ISIS considers the early Islamic figures as sources of authority. They are the authority of Islam, and there's a mainstream currents in Islam that believe that Salaf, the ancestors, the early, the three generations of the first three generations of Islam, are a source of authority, that you can't just rely on the Quran, the Hadith. You have to rely on the interpretation of how these generations interpreted Islam, right? So in a way, you can argue against Salafism, and that's one of the advantages of ISIS. They don't make you argue with them; they make you argue with Salafism in general. And so you get lost by, you need to deal with the centuries, all like centuries worth of literature and sayings and fatwas, and as long as you start becoming distracted by that, they're good, right? But that doesn't mean you don't deal with these problems. I think there's no enough attention to these kind of problems that, like you said, the historical precedents, but also religious, precedents set by the prophets and by the first caliphs, who the prophet recommended as sources of legislation for Sunnis at least, and so on. So they rely on these authorities to justify their acts. So it's I understand what you're saying. It's, they rely on these events. They don't they don't make Quran as their priority, because if you rely on the Quran, you don't have a lot of problems. You have less problems because you still have crucifixion, you have cutting the hands of thieves in the Quran, right? But you don't have beheading, and you don't have other like burning people alive and all this kind of savagery or savage acts. So they justify enslaving women. I mean, it's not really it's not an invention by ISIS. Enslaving women was Islamic for a long time. During times of war, they would conquer an area, and when ISIS enslaved the Yazidi women, the way they did it, basically, they in Islam, you can only take taxes and offer three choices to Christians and Jews only. They consider the people of the book. So when you conquer an area, you can give these people three choices: either convert, pay taxes, or be killed. For Yazidis, they're not part of the people of the book. They are considered devil worshippers by ISIS, and so they considered them as legitimate targets to enslave their women, kill their males, and expel the rest outside their areas. So it's like basically ethnic cleansing or a sectarian cleansing or religious cleansing. So they justify it. They can find justifications for these things. If you talk to ISIS member and say, why did you do that? They would say immediately, they refer you to a religion, and they can talk to you for like hours about how this is justified.
Okay, these two questions together, please, and then.
On the subject of ethnic cleansing, the Graham Wood article that Professor Miller talked about earlier mentions the possibility of genocide if ISIS takes over parts with significant Shia populations. What do you think of the likelihood that ISIS could kind of create whole-scale slaughter of people that they declare to be takfir or otherwise not in compliance with what they see as proper worship?
I agree with you when you say that it's impossible to counteract ISIS and they're immune to moderate Muslim discourse. But I come from France, where you have a lot of young people joining Daesh or ISIS, even families, even young parents with their children. How can one prevent this from happening? I mean, prior to them being sensible to the discourse. And then how do you suggest?
I think we'll leave it at that. We have, okay.
Yeah.
Quick answer.
So ISIS is genocidal. I think it will never. It's expansionist essentially. It's about killing. Any area that ISIS controls, nobody can be tolerated unless they believe in the ideology or they're subjected by ideology, pacified. So Shiites living in ISIS areas, that's impossible. They would have to be either annihilated or they have to leave. So it's an existential threat to a lot of people who don't believe in the ideology. Is that what you're looking for? So how to counter it? If I know the answers, I'll get a lot of money for that. how to counter ISIS ideology. Like I told you, it's almost too late whenever someone starts buying into ISIS ideology and discourse. Before that, it's really difficult because a lot of parents, tell me that they were surprised that their sons joined ISIS. One of them, for example, I actually cite him in the book. He used the child would use an application called Zello. I don't know if anyone involved in pro-democracy activism. The application is very useful for in countries that countries in the Middle East. So you don't have the government cannot monitor the application. What the application does, basically, it turns your a smartphone or phone into a walkie-talkie, and you can start listening to sermons from ISIS in these territories, and you can listen to them from your home. You don't have to have access to the internet or social media or all that sort of things. A lot of parents, for example, one parent said that he found his son listening to these sermons. And he said, don't listen to these people. They're crazy, they're misled, they're deviant group, and they're Khawarij and all this kind of stuff that Muslims label ISIS with. And the child would say, no, I'm curious about what they say. I don't like them and so on. A few months later, he disappeared and he joined ISIS, and he called his parents from the borders of Iraq, and he said, I'm with the brothers. So, it's difficult to do it after that. A personal note, I think as I was writing the book and researching it, I feared for my own son. I was like, how can you prevent, how can you make sure that this person won't join groups like that? It just, it's really hard to kind of predict who can join ISIS.
Okay. One last question from the overflow. Does ISIS is a threat for Central Asia?
It's a threat for anywhere where I'm not sure. I'm not an expert in Central Asia, but I know that a lot of Central Asians are in Syria and Iraq. They come from different countries. In terms of symbolism for ISIS, they have this kind of Khorasan discourse, which is an area that historically used to be controlled by Muslims. It's still, but it used to be a center for a lot of movements in Islamic history, which is in Central Asia, and they appeal to a lot of people. Al Qaeda appealed to them, and ISIS can appeal to them, but I can't claim to be an expert on ISIS.
Hassan, thank you very much for, our time is off, I'm sorry, for your presentation. You can purchase the book outside, and Hassan will sign it for you.
What time is it?
1 o'clock.
Do you have time? Do you have time?
Yeah, to sign the book, yeah.
No, as in, does it need to be...